I know. It was a cause.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, okay.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Mylène Simard, and I'm an event facilitator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Treaty 1 territory and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the launch of Towards a Godless Dominion, Unbelief in Interwar Canada by Elliot Hanowski. Thank you so much to McGill-Queens University Press for publishing this book and making this event a possibility. Following a reading from Elliot and a conversation hosted by Julie Gard, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. If you are one of those here in person, please raise your hand. I will come over to you with the microphone so that the people watching at home can hear your questions. And if you are attending online on our live stream, please type your question into the chat and I will pass it along to the author. I'll be back at the close of the event to go over the signing procedure, but we do ask that you remain seated for a few moments while we relocate Elliot over to the signing table. Towards a Godless Dominion explores both anti-religious activism and the organized opposition unbelievers faced from Christian Canada during the interwar period. Challenging the stereotype of Canada as a tolerant, secular nation, this book returns to a time when intolerant forms of Christianity ruled a country that was considered more religious than the United States. Its author, Elliot Hanowski, is a librarian at the University of Manitoba and has a PhD in history from Queen's University. He is one of the founders of the International Society for Historians of Atheism, Secularism, and Humanism. Our host for this evening is Julie Gard, a professor in the History and Labor Studies Department at the University of Manitoba. Her latest book is 2019's Radical Housewives, Price Wars and Food Politics in Mid-20th Century Canada. We'll be hearing more from her later, but for now, please join me in welcoming Elliot Hanowski.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Put these things out on the internet, and don't know who's going to show up, but thank you for showing up. So I have a few little remarks. I don't want to spoil the conversation that we're going to have. So I just wanted to say a few things to start. The first is that in the 2021 census, over 1/3 of Canadians said that they had no religion or that they had a secular perspective. So that's atheists, humanists, and so forth. This has been rising fast in Canada. It doubled from 16.5% in 2001 to 34.6% in 2021. And so that represents about 12.6 million people. Sociologists and scholars of religion have been quick to dig into these trends to better understand what's going on. But despite the significant presence in today's Canadian population, very little work has been done to understand the history of non-religious people and unbelievers in Canada. In the 1980s, the esteemed historian Ramsay Cook included a chapter about freethinkers and rationalists in 19th century Canada in his book, The Regenerators, which won a Governor General's award. But then there wasn't much until recently. Two historians that are based in the most secular of provinces, British Columbia, have recently published books about unbelievers in BC in the 19th century and in the mid-20th century, respectively. But that's about it. So I hope my book can make a small but significant contribution to the historical literature and maybe even a contribution to the self-understanding of Canadians today. I had a professor once who said to me that Canada's greatest natural resource is our sense of moral superiority. We like to think of ourselves as a tolerant and pluralist and multicultural nation, or at least more so than the Americans, right? How much that is actually true is open to debate. But looking back at the interwar period, which I do in my book, is to look at a time of government-backed intolerance in Canada, when the vast majority of the population shared a single religion, and you could be punished, and it happened, for speaking out against that religion. So I think that studying history can be a great way to shake up our preconceptions and to challenge our stereotypes that we have about ourselves. And I hope that my book helps in that process. Okay, so I don't want to give too much away. I'm looking forward to discussing these ideas with Professor Julie Gard. So I'll sit down, and thanks again for coming.
Great. Well, I have to say this is a fascinating read. I was really pleased that Elliot asked me to do this, because I'm not sure that I would have picked this book up otherwise, but I'm really glad that I had the chance to read it and to read it so carefully. So thank you for that. And the book surprised me in a number of ways, I have to say. One of the things that I was surprised to learn from your book was that religion in early 20th century, the rejection of religion in early 20th century Canada was not only well organized, but that encompassed so much variety. And I wonder if you could describe some of the varieties of irreligion that people espoused in that period.
Well, I mean, they're growing out of pre-existing traditions. In the 19th century, we see rationalists, freethinkers. Freethinker was more an American term. Rationalists were more British, and secularists. And then in the 1930s, you start to see the term humanist start to be used in the sense of secular humanism, which is where we get today's secular humanists in sort of the 20th century. But that's more sort of, these are the traditions in the English-speaking, among English-speaking Canadians. Of course, Quebec had its own traditions, which tended to be more anti-clerical, which is sort of something that you see in Catholic countries, especially where people are opposed to the political power of the church, so of the clerics, literally. And so that often is sort of interlinked with sometimes with liberal politics, sometimes with anarchist politics. So that's kind of what we see in Quebec in the period that I'm looking at, is that a more anti-clerical tradition. But it's interesting to see how these different traditions they come out of. So like rationalists and secularists in English-speaking Canada tend to be coming out of a Protestant background, whereas, of course, in Quebec, it's a Catholic background that they're reacting against. And so you see somewhat different emphases in what they're attacking. So like the blasphemous libel case that we're going to be talking about in English-speaking Canada, he's attacking the Bible, and that's what he gets in trouble for, whereas in Quebec, they're attacking the church and the church as an administration, right? So these, they share a lot of common beliefs about atheism, about secularism, and so forth, but there are different emphases in how they express those beliefs.
Yes, right. And we'll get into that some more, I'm sure. So I would say that another thing I thought was really surprising as well was that some of these leading proponents of irreligion and unbelief, they weren't just non-religious. They actually believed fiercely that religion was dangerous. Do you want to tell us about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these people were, today, sociologists use the term the nuns, right? People who on a census reply that, oh, I have no religion, right? And so, but that's an umbrella term that covers a great many different sorts of beliefs. And so the people that, I'm talking about in the book are very much not, they're not just nuns, they're not just indifferent, they care deeply, right, about religion. And so in a way, growing secularization is almost an enemy of some of these groups, because if people don't care, well, they don't bother coming to your atheist meeting either, right? If they feel that they can avoid religion, well, then they just avoid religion and they don't push back. So yeah, the people that I'm looking at were very much convinced that religion was, a malign influence over humanity, that it was delusional, that it was causing people to focus on the afterlife as opposed to trying to fix this world or trying to do things in this world. And there was a very strong tradition of also seeing it sometimes with a Marxist lens, sometimes with sort of the more rationalist lens of things, but seeing religion as a form of social control, right?
Right. So like tell me more about that. That's really interesting, because like religion is a real present danger, right?
Right. Yeah. So they saw it as sort of a conspiracy of, sometimes they use the term priestcraft, this idea that since the beginning of time, there's been this class of people, the priestly caste, who deliberately sets out to create these lies to control people and to get them to give money to the church and to support the priestly caste in their lavish lifestyle, right? And so this is definitely a line of argument that you see from these activists. A lot of them, as we'll see, were on the left politically, and were involved with socialist and anarchist movements. And so there you also see this line of reasoning that sees religion as a tool of the capitalist class, right, to keep people happy and content, and not, and just working and doing, being exploited and not fighting back and organizing to try and make this world a better place. Because, well, you'll have, the IWW, right? The Wobblies. You'll have pie in the sky when you die. That's sort of their.
That's a lie.
Right. Exactly. It's a lie. Yeah. So that's their line of attack. So yeah, there was definite, like there's an incident that happens in the Gauvin chapter, Marshall Gauvin in Winnipeg, when he was putting his commercials or his ads for his rationalist lectures on the church page, which was a page of the newspaper that came out every Saturday, showing, churches would advertise their sermons and say, come down and, hear so-and-so talk about this and that. And he would advertise his lectures, debunking, sometimes he would say, I'm going to debunk, Pastor so-and-so's lecture, or Pastor so-and-so's sermon from last week, I'm going to debunk it this week. And he would take direct aim at these different churches and attack them. And so they got irritated with him, and a handful of United Church ministers went to the newspaper and had his ads removed from the church page and put onto the theater page instead, because he doesn't count as a church, right? And so he shouldn't be on the church page. So Gauvin was furious about this, and because he saw this as sort of a direct attack on his leveling mission, his democratic mission to bring reason and democracy to the world, the hierarchical world of religion. And so he went and talked to all the editors that he could, and this one editor said, look, nobody cares about the church page, just little old ladies read the church page. It doesn't matter, stop bothering me, this doesn't matter. But for Gauvin, religion really mattered.
Yes.
He couldn't have, disagreed more. Fighting religion on its own terms, on its own turf, was extremely important to him.
Right. It was like a conspiracy. Right.
Yeah, and in this case, there was an actual conspiracy. It turned out it was these two prominent United Church ministers who had gotten a few others together, and they'd gone to the newspaper offices and had this change made, and he was able to kind of, but and in a way, it kind of fed into his existing beliefs of what ministers were up to, sort of the conspiratorial tactics they would use.
Yeah, right. I guess one of the things that sort of reminds me of is that it's not even just Marshall Gauvin and a few other people. This is a movement, right? This is a movement that spreads right across the nation. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess what sort of led me to write the book in a way is noticing that it's because I started studying Gauvin, and I started seeing similar things happening in other cities across the nation. So we see Gauvin forms this group in 1926. Toronto group, the Rationalist Society of Canada is formed in 1926 as well. And then we see Montreal, the Université Ouvrière formed in 1925. And so there seems to be like this moment happening in the mid-1920s where people start to have these conversations and to put on lectures and to have, have debates and things like that. However, they don't seem to have been a national movement as such, right? Like it was an intellectual moment that people were all kind of doing this at the same time, but they didn't necessarily talk to each other. And I was a bit surprised to find that, but it does fit with Canada as it was at that time, which was sort of this archipelago of little communities, that often had more in contact with the nearest American city than they did with each other. You could take a train across Canada, but like who would bother, right? Like it's just, there's these huge.
Go to Minneapolis.
Right, well that's exactly it, right? Yeah, and so Gauvin comes to Winnipeg from Minneapolis, that he was a Canadian, but he had spent a while in the States going from city to city trying to organize these rationalist societies. But then, yeah, he's brought in from Minneapolis. And similarly, the Toronto rationalists were more in touch with Chicago than they were with Winnipeg. Like I don't think they ever talked to each other. So there are connections that we can see that, and often it's like left-wing socialist connections between the different cities. But as such, the anti-religious movement was they were doing the same things at the same time, but they didn't necessarily talk to each other.
Right, different from the left.
Right.
Okay, well, which reminds me then, I get to my next question, which seems to be right in the right place. So Winnipeg is kind of a hotbed of whatever it is, rationalism, irreligion, unbelief. What accounts for Winnipeg being such a center for this kind of, resistance by people to organized religion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, and I'm still not entirely sure I have all the answers, but partly what's happening in Winnipeg is there does seem to be like a certain openness, because a certain cosmopolitan nature to Winnipeg. There's the journalist James Gray, who I quote, who would go to Gauvin's meetings, and he talks about Winnipeg as being this like cluster of subcultures where there's, it's sort of a new thriving city. Almost everybody's an immigrant of some sort or another, except for obviously the First Nations and Métis people, but most people have only been there for 40 years or less by this point in the 1920s. And there's a lot of immigrants. There's Jews, there's Ukrainians, Polish people. There's like there's a strong working class element to it, like a lot of unions and some, sort of like working class subcultures. And there seems to be this openness where, there are a lot of churches, but they've been established for, only a generation at that point, right? And so there's a bit of a free-for-all, and Gray talks about sort of these vociferous, and assertive subcultures that make themselves known and that are able to kind of coexist, and everybody belongs to some subculture, and that's fine, right? So there's less of an established society than there was necessarily in Toronto or in Nova Scotia and some of these other places that I mentioned.
Right, and so one of the things that happens here is one of the leading figures of this whatever non-movement, whatever moment, as Marshall Gauvin. His history is really interesting. Can you talk about Marshall Gauvin?
Sure, yeah. So he was born in New Brunswick and was raised by, I think his father was Catholic and his mother was a Baptist. He was raised in this household where religious argument was kind of normal. He went through a conversion experience at age 18 or so and got baptized. But then that same year, he went to Boston to hang out with his older brothers and sisters, and they had all become freethinkers in the States, and there was a strong free thought movement in Boston. And so he got pulled into that, started reading a lot of people like Robert Ingersoll, the great rationalist freethinker in the States, Thomas Paine, these radical authors. So then he becomes a freethinker and starts memorizing the Bible so that he can pick it apart, to criticize it. He gets a job as a carpenter And but then in 1912, so there's sort of a free thought golden age, sort of from 1875 to 1900, roughly. And so he's sort of radicalized as part of that. But then he decides to become a free thought lecturer in 1912 when the movement is kind of slowing down and there's a generation that's kind of passing away. But he decides to do it. And so then he travels around to a few different cities trying to organize these rationalist communities with varying degrees of success. There's this quote where one of his friends says, oh, you know, Gauvin, like he's a great guy, he's a great lecturer, he's probably the best rationalist lecturer alive today, you know, but he keeps being faced by indifference. And there's this one atheist said to him, look, God died a long time ago. I don't need to come to your meetings every Sunday to hear you kill him over again, like every Sunday, right? He's gone. Like, let's just move on, right? So there is this kind of feeling of a certain amount of apathy, I guess, that he's faced with. But he gets asked to come to Winnipeg by the R.B. Russell, the leader of the One Big Union, coming out of the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. Which was active in putting out anti-religious material in their lectures that they would host and in their newspaper. And so he comes and he gets such a great reception from people in Winnipeg that he decides to move to Winnipeg, brings his wife and daughter, and they set up this rationalist society that then lasts for until 1940, so the next 14 years or so, and manages that this is his day job, right? Like, is giving these lectures every Sunday. In the evenings and afternoons and evenings, and who, except for in the summer, but this is his day job. He takes up collections. He writes his, a new lecture every week, and he's able to make a go of it right through the worst of the Great Depression. So there was definitely like a strong subculture here that was able to support him.
Yeah, he's really a fascinating character. There's another fascinating character, and that's the one in Montreal. Can you tell us about him?
Oh, okay, sure, yeah. So Albert Saint-Martin, I guess is,
yes,
yeah,
Albert
okay,
Saint-Martin.
Yeah. So he's another, interesting person. Because he comes out of this, because Quebec, it has a reputation for being in this time period extremely conservative, extremely religious, and in many ways it was. But there was a subculture of people, pushing back, and so Albert Saint-Martin comes. He sort of gets radicalized around the turn of the 20th century. He gets involved with various, like there's liberal clubs, socialist clubs, anarchists, and he's involved with Esperanto, this artificial language that is created to try and unite humanity around a new language that won't be, partisan. So he becomes part of pretty much any radical group, that will take him. He's very active. He's an organizer, and very charismatic. And this is something that's true of most of the leaders that I talk about. They're able to pull people to them and organize a community around themselves. He joins the Communist Party in the early 1920s, but then he gets kicked out because he says, look, Quebec, it's not, not a unique, right? Yeah, not a unique story, right? But he says Quebec needs to have its own wing of the Communist Party because it has its own issues, and they say that's, we don't believe in that. Get out of here. So he goes and forms this Université Ouvrière, the labor university, which is basically he rents rooms in some of the poorest neighborhoods of Montreal, and organizes lectures, has a library, has a social club, and tries to radicalize people. And so he still considers himself communist, or a small c communist. But his big, what I think, like his probably the most common topic that he talks about is anti-religious propaganda, or anti-religious arguments. So I argue in my book that he, even though he's coming at it from a slightly different perspective, his group is very much parallel with the ones in Toronto and Winnipeg that I discussed. And if you wanted to hear an argument about why the Pope was corrupt, or why the Virgin Mary never existed, or whatever it is, that you would go to his meetings on a Sunday. But of course, Quebec was hostile to this belief system. And of course, he faced a lot of persecution and violence for doing what he did.
Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. So Gauvin, Saint-Martin, he was very popular. He did have there was hundreds of people, sometimes, like there was supposed to be at least 1,000, maybe 2,000 associated with his organization. But they also faced a great deal of pushback. So some of this was unofficial. There were Catholic students who were very militant, who came to his meetings. One time they took all of the furniture, threw it out the window and smashed it. They took his whole library, burned it out on the street. Came and would fight with his followers. And at one point in the 1930s, there's the strongest fascist movement in Canada was in Quebec, and he starts sort of sparring with them, and he gets jumped by some fascists and badly beaten.
Surprise.
And so while he's recovering from that, though, he's also facing official persecution. So the government of Quebec was kept hitting him with blasphemous libel charges, and so he gets found guilty of that. They take pity on him because he's still recovering from his beating from the fascists. Like, he's an old man at this point, and is quite ill. And so they fine him, $100, I think it is. But they also put these sort of bonds on him that if he ever starts openly discussing this stuff or openly lecturing on these topics and insulting the church, then he'll have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars that he doesn't have. So he's really pushed back into the shadows in a way. He has a lieutenant, a man named Gaston Pilon, who's very outspoken and vehement in his condemnations of the church. He too gets convicted of blasphemous libel and goes to prison for a year of hard labor. And halfway through that, he cracks and converts to Catholicism. He becomes an outspoken, vehement Catholic, just as he had been an outspoken, vehement atheist. And it's a very sad story. The local clergy are, congratulating themselves on what a wonderful thing that God has done for them to convert this man. And it's like, yeah, you threw him in prison. Anyways, the Quebec story is unique in how vicious the pushback is and how these people are pushed back into the shadows. And of course, with the coming of Maurice Duplessis, the new premier, Quebec is even more conservative into the next, 30s, 40s, and 50s. There's just like hardly any, open display of this kind of free thought or this kind of anti-clericalism, until of course, suddenly the Quiet Revolution happens, and then suddenly now, today Quebec is one of the least religious provinces in Canada, right? So like the world that Saint-Martin was working for sort of came, but not on his schedule.
Yeah, very interesting. So one of the things that, obviously has come up a few times as you've talked is the relationship between irreligion and its proponents and the Canadian left. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. The historiography, like the books that have been written about free thought and rationalism in the UK and in the United States often show that there's this sort of split between sort of socialists and communists and radicals on the one hand, and then the rationalist tradition, which tends to be, there are parts of it that are quite radical politically, but other parts that are kind of more liberal, a little more centrist, a little more, they don't want to get distracted by political arguments. They just want to focus on, attacking religion and leave it at that. They don't want to be seen as too radical, because that's dangerous, right? And they're more interested in the individual's right, the individual's conscience, the individual's right to free speech and so forth. So there's a bit of a divide there in those stories. But what I found in Canada is that there's actually a lot more engagement between leftism and free thought movement and rationalism. So in Winnipeg, we have Marshall Gauvin drawing his congregation from working class radicals associated with one big union, especially. He himself he calls himself a socialist. He's kind of flirts with, progressive liberalism. He's kind of all over the place. But then he fights with the One Big Union because he tries to give lectures on topics other than anti-religion. I think sometimes he feels like he's running out of material, so he tries to talk about economics or psychology. But when he talks about economics, he talks about this very sort of idealistic liberal view of economics that's at odds with the leadership of the One Big Union, who are moving more towards a militant Marxism. So they fight over that, and they kind of, the leadership at least, sort of distances themselves from him. But then in the 1930s, with the huge crisis of capitalism, of the Great Depression, he gets really involved with communist politics and starts to work alongside the Popular Front, which is trying to push back against fascism and trying to help the unemployed and things like that. So he's working with communists in that context, and he starts saying very positive things about communism. But then, at the beginning of World War II, suddenly, the Soviet Union signs this non-aggression pact with the Nazis, and he's just shocked by what he sees as this huge betrayal of the anti-fascist cause, and then he speaks out against communism and then loses a big chunk of his followers. So I think that split kind of is one of the reasons that he gives up lecturing. In Toronto, there's some similarities. Like there's the rationalists there, they start out in this more traditional, individual liberty kind of tradition. But then again, as the Great Depression happens, you see them start engaging more and more with left-wing thinkers, left-wing activists, and eventually the leader of the rationalists in Toronto, Bertrand Levins, decides to start running for the CCF, the forerunner of the NDP, at that time very sort of much a democratic socialist movement in the 1930s. And so he eventually takes his energy away from promoting rationalist thought and into running as a socialist. And so there's and a lot of the people who give lectures at his at the organization that he runs are connected with unions, with radical parties and so forth. So there's a lot of crossover there as well. And then of course in Quebec, as I've already referred to, they're very the people I'm looking at are very much identified with sort of an independent form of communism, as well as some anarchist elements. They read a lot of literature that's produced by anarchists in Europe and use that in their propaganda activities.
Right, interesting, because he's also got, as you say, these people that spoke at with his under the auspices of his organization. Some of them are actually members of the CCF, not just Levins, but others as well, which I think is really interesting because the CCF is, of course, an amalgam of people with different political views on the left, but some of them are social gospelers. So how do they manage to get along with a rationalist and an atheist who's promoting atheism?
Yeah, it's interesting. We have this stereotype of the early CCF is very much social gospel people, and there's some truth to that. Like people like Stanley Knowles, who were ministers, and Wordsworth, of course, J.S. Wordsworth, who was a minister. Although by the 20s and 30s, he still uses some Christian language, but he's personally mostly a sort of a humanist, agnostic in his personal views. But they do go heavily on that sort of like showing that there is this sort of radical tradition in the Bible and this radical tradition in Christianity that they can draw on to bolster their socialist arguments. But I think more recent scholarship has also shown that there are a lot of different people under that umbrella of the CCF. And so like James Naylor's recent book on the fate of labor socialism and others have shown that there are a lot of independent Marxists and independent socialists of various stripes who end up in the CCF and who don't have a lot of time for that religious language, who are a lot more militant and secular in their outlook. And so, yeah, I was interested. I mean, no one had really written on this, so I was kind of surprised to stumble across it and find that, people are constantly, just down to this day, they criticize socialists and leftists as being godless and secular. And that's a constant attack. But there actually were these atheist activists who were big supporters of the CCF and who were active in that. And so Sometimes they just own that and they're like, sure, fine. But other times I think they try to downplay it a bit because they didn't want to be seen as godless communists. And I think one of the reasons we don't have these stories is because during the Cold War, that was a line of attack that they were desperate to avoid, right? And so that you didn't say, oh yeah, look back at our great lead, our great pioneers of our party who were all atheists. Like, you didn't want to talk about that.
Right, and obviously, according to your book, there's a really good reason for that, because it turns out I was surprised at the extent. I mean, I think I'm sort of savvy to like the persecution of people by the state. I had no idea that the Canadian state persecuted people who were atheists to the extent that they did. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on that fascinating history?
Yeah, it's something that, as I referred to in my remarks at the beginning, we have this idea of Canada as this secular, especially more secular than the Americans, right? And like separation of church and state and all of that. But that was
I have my notes.
that was definitely not the case. In the interwar period, and that really only is an artifact of the 1960s and after. There's a historian, evangelical historian Mark Knoll, who argues that Canada was actually more religious by most standards than the States was, and there was no division of church and state in the way that we think of it, usually. And so there was this law in the books of blasphemous libel that it was kind of phrased negatively. It said, if you are making arguments in good faith about religious topics in a respectful way, then you won't be charged with blasphemous libel. But what that meant was that if they could prove that you were intending to hurt people's feelings and trying to rile people up with your anti-religious arguments, then you could be found guilty of blasphemous libel, right? So, so I talk in my book about Ernest Sterry, the British immigrant who comes to Toronto and puts out a rationalist newspaper and gets convicted of blasphemous libel and goes to prison for a number of months for doing so. And then, of course, it was used repeatedly again and again in Quebec to punish people like Albert Saint-Martin, Gaston Pilon, and a number of others, although it was also wielded against Protestants. So anyone who, any Protestants who criticized the hold of the Catholic Church over Quebec in a certain way, they could also be tried with this, right? So it was a weapon that was used in a number of ways. And so, and that remained on the books until 2018, that law. It was still part of Canadian law. It wasn't used after the 1940s, but it sort of was hanging there in the backdrop. There was also the laws around customs and what literature could be brought into the country. And so the customs officials had the right to stop stuff at the border that they considered obscene or blasphemous. And so usually what would happen is somebody, a member of the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire, or somebody like that would get all upset about something and write a letter to the customs officials and say, this book is obscene or this book is blasphemous, don't let it into the country. And so then they would stop it at the border. And so you see this with a lot of the mainstream free thought journals in the States that for much of the 20th century, or the late 19th and 20th centuries, they're not permitted into the country. And sometimes the saving grace, perhaps, was that, at least for rationalists, was that the enforcement was sometimes spotty, and so they would forget, or it would get through the customs, but then it would get cut off again when somebody protested. So this whole idea of free speech, for liberal British subjects, was very, it didn't really apply to atheists or agnostics or people like that. That was, although, as we've talked about in the past, a lot of this gets applied on a very class basis, right? And so,
like Sterry.
Exactly, yeah. So there are, pretofessors and writers who are putting out these anti-religious arguments, but they don't get prosecuted. It's working class people like Sterry. Like pretty much everybody I talk about here was coming from a working class background. They were self-taught, autodidacts. Like they had read a lot of books and come to these conclusions on their own. They didn't go to university, and it's because they're bringing these arguments to working class audiences that they're seen as very dangerous. Right? And so those are the people who get convicted of these crimes and who get persecuted, because there's this fear that it's Christianity that holds that underpins the moral fabric of society, and if you endanger that, then suddenly society is going to fall apart, and maybe the working class will rise up against their oppressors, right? There's this fear of revolution, right? I think that's part of it.
And they actually say that, right? The courts actually say the nation will potentially be destroyed by this stuff.
Yeah, they use the most apocalyptic language in their charges and the speeches given by the district attorney or the crown attorneys and the judges and so forth. Yeah, they really see this as a mortal threat to the fabric of Canada.
I don't know if you remember this, or this is like a trick question, I hope not, but there's a great line that you have in there, but it's compared, they say the language that was used, you say the language used about religion was, you know what I'm going.
Right. Yeah, they talk, especially the Globe newspaper in those years was extremely fundamentalist, like, and I use that in the technical sense of they were literally like called themselves fundamentalists in its outlook, and they, yeah, the way they talked about the life-destroying aspects of atheism or secularism, like they talked about it in terms usually reserved for sexually transmitted diseases. Like if you caught atheism, you're going to go blind and die and go insane. You know, like yeah,
it's pretty remarkable. I mean, it's not funny really, but you know, it is.
Yeah.
And yeah. So the other thing I think that you've just touched on that I think is interesting is that these people, these rationalists and so on, this was all working class, right? This is a working class movement, pretty much. This is not the middle class. They're doing something else. I don't know what they're doing here. There are some people who, you know, who are sort of free speech defenders. I don't know, you have a few of those, right? There's like a smattering of them.
Yeah, the Toronto Star was quite favorable to the rationalists. They didn't ever editorialize in favor of them, but their reporting was quite favorable. There were newspapers that spoke out against the prosecutions of atheists. You know, so there were people who tried to apply these sort of liberal principles of free speech. But for the most part, the people who went to bat for the atheists and the rationalists were socialists and communists. So we see J.S. Woodsworth in the 1920s trying to, in Parliament, overthrow the law, get rid of the law of blasphemous libel. And so he has a few allies on the left who they try and push this through Parliament. And they're roundly rejected by the vast majority of parliamentarians who are like, absolutely not, like this, we have to preserve the Christian nature of Canada. And so you see communists trying to organize a bit to try and support some of these the defendants in these cases. So there were radicals who were willing to do it, but most people, you know, I mean, from a historical point of view, free speech has never been an absolute value and probably never can be, right? And so the free speech is always this politically contested value that people fight over. And so in this time period, free speech was not considered to be, didn't really apply to atheists or you know, radicals in that, you know, people who were speaking against Christianity, that they were beyond outside the pale, right? So
too unpopular.
Right.
Yeah, right, interesting, like, you know, like today, in a different way. So just, you know, so we covered the whole, the spread of your research. You also talk about these, you know, atheists and rationalists and religionists and so on in other parts of Canada, like the East Coast and BC. Can you just maybe do a rundown of how it worked there as well?
Well, I didn't, yeah, that's the thing, the problem with historical research, right? You can only work with the material that you find. And so there's not a lot of sources available in those areas. And I hope that someone else comes along and proves me wrong and writes a great book on some of these other areas. But so what I did was I kind of looked at a couple religious controversies that broke out, one in BC around faith healing and one in Nova Scotia around a textbook that was teaching evolution. And so there was these religious conflicts that broke out where people were arguing about, the true nature of Christianity and the true nature of what, Canadian society, how it should be organized around certain religious beliefs or not. And so in those controversies, there's an opening for atheists to speak up and make their voices heard. And so that's kind of what I looked at and to try and get a sense for what was happening in those places. And so I came across in BC, William J. Curry, who was maybe the only university educated person I talked about, who was a dentist, who was the red dentist, they called And he would give lectures on socialism, but he would also give a lot of lectures on rationalism and free thought and attacking religion. And so although he too eventually, as the Great Depression comes on, he decides to turn his attention towards politics and kind of gives up the anti-religious lecturing. So there were people like that. Nova Scotia was quite conservative. There were atheists there too. A few of them spoke up, but they had to be very, very cautious. And Nova Scotia was conservative along the lines of Ontario or Quebec, whereas there seems to have been this more openness in the West, so in BC and in Manitoba as well. So there were little stories there, and I hope somebody else comes along and digs into those regions more. As I mentioned in the beginning, there are some historians working in British Columbia looking at why British Columbia is so much more secular than the rest of Canada, even in this time period. But there's still a lot of work to be done.
Interesting, yeah. One of the things that just remind me of is like when you talk about your sources and how people were the evidence of people engaged in activities related to your religion doesn't exactly jive with the census and what people report. Maybe you could just recap that a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So atheists and unbelievers, sort of the umbrella term, they often don't show up very much, and like they're a tiny percentage of people on the census. But I think that, I mean, there's this tendency that a lot of scholars have noticed, is that Canadians will lie on surveys when asked about their religion, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I go to church 3 times a week." You know, like there's an urge that, at least up until recently, many Canadians felt the need to project this kind of religious reputation that they didn't actually practice privately, right? And so in the census, somebody came to your door and verbally stood there and asked you questions in this time period. So you had a lot of, there was a peer pressure to say certain things and to present yourself as just a good old, regular Canadian who goes to the Methodist church down the street, and like, and there was a lot of pressure to not openly say these things, because it wasn't you weren't privately sitting at home filling the form out. You had to say it to usually somebody who is hired from your neighborhood to do the census work. So I found, yeah, there was often a disconnect between the statistics around your religion and versus what people were actually doing or saying, more, like not less official venues.
Right, and interesting, as I remember from reading that chapter, the same applied actually to Jews, who similarly would claim to be Jewish religiously, but probably not, right?
Right, yeah, there was definitely, I did, at least in the Winnipeg case where I have better sources, I was able to find there was a contingent of secular Jews who came out to Gauvin's meetings and supported him and were active in that. And that, I think, partly in that sort of that diverse subcultural Winnipeg that we were talking about, there was a niche there for secular Jews to get away from their traditional religious beliefs and to kind of carve out a space for themselves. But there are little hints here and there. It's weird, again, I hope some other historian comes along and writes a book about this, but there are little hints about, like, there's like a group of anarchist Jews who create a secularist, a rationalist school that's an alternative to the religious schools in Montreal, for example. And there's little hints of these stories, but yeah, someone else needs to dig into those sources and tell it one day.
Well, maybe then they become, members of the United Jewish People's Order.
Well, for sure, and there again is always a huge overlap between people on the left, and so I forget her name now, Esther. She wrote a Future Without Want or Need.
Esther Ryder.
Esther Ryder, yeah, she wrote a book recently about the history
Future
of the
Without Want or Need.
Yeah, with the history of the Jewish left, and she talks about some of these people who would emphasize Yiddish over Hebrew, right? Because Yiddish could have
Yiddishkeit, the whole Yiddishkeit movement.
Right. Yeah. So there is another story there, and there's a little bit of overlap with my story, but most people I looked at were coming from this more like Anglophone, rationalist free thought society, or tradition that was more, resisting either Protestantism or, of course, in the case of Quebec, resisting Catholicism. But there are other other kinds of rebellions happening at that time against other religions.
Right, despite the costs.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, the only question I had is that I think you said that you have a number of takeaways from this research that you thought were really interesting and useful in terms of making this history particularly relevant for us today.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing, I guess, from a historical point of view, is that, I mentioned there's been a lot of work written on the golden age of free thought, which was in the late 19th century. And then people say, well, and then that kind of generation ended. But I guess what I found in my research is that that movement did continue into the 1920s and 30s, into the 20th century. So it carried on. Another takeaway is that we forget how conservative and repressive Canadian society was in the 1920s and 30s, like in this first part of the 20th century. There are people who push back against that, of course, but there were costs, and there was persecution. So it's a good reminder that, what we think of as just natural Canadian values, those were fought for and struggled for and came at a cost, right? And I think, I don't know the point, but now I'm blanking on it. Well, there is like a tradition today of people who are, well, yeah, I was going to say about the connections with the left, right? That people couldn't avoid. You could attack the Bible, you could attack the churches, you could argue about how irrational religion was, but at some point someone was going to turn around and say, okay, well, how do we live our lives then? Like, how should we organize society? And so, like, do we talk about birth control? Do we talk about challenging patriarchal values and the nuclear family? And, like, do we talk about challenging the structures of economic oppression? Like, do we, and especially during the Great Depression, you couldn't avoid the crisis, the social and economic crisis that was happening. So people started talking about capitalism, right? And so, I feel like what this story shows is that politics is unavoidable for people who are wanting to criticize religion. They also have to talk about social and political issues. And today there are, as the percentage of people who are non-religious grows, we have seen groups like the Sunday Assembly and others who are trying to recreate unbelieving and anti-religious or irreligious organizations and associations, and give people a social forum to discuss their secular values. And I think one of the lessons is that, politics can't be left out, because eventually it's going to find a way, people are going to start arguing about these issues. And so that can be a great strength, but that can also be a divisive thing that causes people to sort of fall out with one another and start arguing, right? So you can rally around your opposition to religion, but then, you have to keep asking the next question and the next question and talk about these broader issues.
Right, okay, well, thank you.
All right, thank you.
We have time for a few questions if you'd like to throw to the audience. Anybody have any questions?
Hi, did any of, do I say my name before the question? Or?
Sure.
Dylan. Did any of these organizers, like, you talked a bit about the social gospel, but did any of them encounter Unitarians and have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because there were, in the Winnipeg, at least in the Winnipeg source material that I was able to look at, people's, the membership lists of the group here in Winnipeg. And there were some Icelandic Unitarians who showed up, because Icelandic people were really into Unitarianism at that time period. And so I think that some Unitarians did get attracted, sort of people who were more the secular or the more progressive end of Unitarianism did get attracted to this rationalist organization. And in the 1950s and 60s and like into the 70s, actually, Marshall Gauvin, after he gives up lecturing, he I did find some correspondence with Unitarians in the sort of second half of the 20th century. So that because I think in that time period, if you were a sort of a secular humanist kind of person, the Unitarian organization was kind of a natural, there was an affinity there, and so Gauvin was talking to them a bit. So they're kind of, yeah. I only found a few fragments, but there is some connections there.
Anyone else have any questions? All right, I think that's it.
Okay.
One possibility, yes.
Oh,
Okay,
over here.
yeah. People have to think for a minute.
I have a question about, the title of the book says that it's about the interwar period, so it's between the two world wars. The fact that Canada as a nation went through their involvement in the First World War and then the Second World War, did either of those kind of major events impact, why is it in between those two major events is the focus of the book, and did that happen? Do you have any hypotheses as to why then?
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I think one thing that happened is that I was talking about that golden age of rationalism and free thought in the late 19th century, and what we see is that generation of those leaders and speakers and writers start to die off around the turn of the 20th century, and so that kind of ends by that movement. Excuse me, it's kind of ended by 1914. And during World War I, there's this, people tend to forget how intensely that was propagandized as a war for Christianity, as a war against the godless Hun of Germany who was going to destroy religion and destroy Christianity, right? Even though they were all Christians themselves. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? But like the truth, the reality of it didn't matter, but it was an intensely religious time. And so there was very little, I found, sort of open atheism in that time period. But then after, in the 1920s, I think there's a reaction to a lot of the propaganda and the jingoism of World War I, and there's this sort of secular or sort of cynical secular mood that takes over in a lot of, and so we see this a lot in literature. And I have a few pages in my book where I talk about, there's a lot of like war novels written by veterans in the 1920s and 30s who are extremely skeptical of religion and who write about the war and talk about like, who could believe in the judgment of a God when we face the judgment of shell fire and like the horror of war, and so there is this disillusionment that we see among a lot of veterans. And so I think it's hard to draw hard and fast lines about the lines of influence, but there was an openness. I think the aftermath of the war and the suffering involved did open some people up to sort of questioning a lot of the certainties that had been used to preach people into fighting the war. And afterwards people were like, well, the world didn't change that much, and the better world that you promised us didn't come, and like where was God in all of this, right? So there is an openness to skepticism that I think helps help this movement find willing listeners.
Okay. If you have any more questions, you can pose them directly to Elliot at the signing table. I'm just going to ask you to remain seated for a few moments. We're going to safely transport the author over to the signing desk. Feel free to grab a copy of the book either at the cash desk or at the signing desk, get it signed before paying for it. But do remember to pay for it before you leave. I'd like to warmly thank Julie and Elliot for all these personal.